Welcome today to week 4 of our Stay Calm and Well webinar series, part 4. Today we are going to be talking about gardening as a self-care practice. I personally am pretty excited about this topic, a little different. The sun is shining, so it just kind of gets me excited for nicer weather and nicer days ahead. A couple of housekeeping items. If you have any questions throughout the session, please use the Q&A function down in your Zoom menu below. If someone has a question similar to yours, please use the thumbs up button to like it. The top ones will go to the top, and we'll do our best to answer them all at the end of the session. If you need closed captioning or subtitles throughout the presentation, please use the CC button in your Zoom menu below, and you can have the subtitles pop up for you. This webinar is being recorded. We will post it on our website, hopefully by the end of the week. And I think that should be enough. So I'd like to introduce Patrice Powers-Barker. She's a family and consumer sciences educator for Ohio State Extension in Lucas County. So I will kick it over to Patrice and welcome everyone.
Thank you, David. So today we are going to talk about gardening as a self-care practice. And as part of this larger series of Stay Calm and Well, what I'd like to do is just kind of review some of the things we talked about last week when Jenny Laub talked about the Quarantine 15. So hopefully you've had a chance to think about that and maybe think about what are some of those positive perspectives you can bring to your daily habits and your approach to Quarantine 15. Not only last week, but some of the things we learned from previous weeks. Have you been able to chunk any goals and celebrate those small achievements? And also, we've talked about identifying your cues and modifying your environment to set yourself up for success and seeking out additional support when you're ready. So this week, we're going to use some of those same concepts, and we'll share this again at the end, kind of as encouragement for you to think about in this week number 4. But our theme this week is about gardening. So throughout the next less than 30 minutes, I'll be encouraging you to think about how can you use gardening to complement your other practices of health and well-being. And also think about your own self-care needs, and can plants be part of that as setting yourself up for success. And you will hear me remind you throughout this that it is excellent to dream big, and there is nothing wrong with starting small. So with a lot of things, but especially with gardening. I don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed in the middle of summer. So really thinking about what's going to work best for you. And then also very much like past weeks, seeking out additional support to learn more. And I'm really going to focus on how you can connect with some of your local resources. So before we really dive into this topic of gardening as self-care, I just want to kind of let everyone know who's here on the call, welcome. And whether you are a brand new gardener and have never done it before, you belong here. Whether you've been gardening in the past or maybe trying something new, we're really glad that you're attending today. And I would like to also let you know that I realize not everyone wants to garden, although everyone can garden. So if you're on today listening to this and you're thinking, well, yeah, I'd love to use gardening as self-care, and you fill in the blank with a personal example. Maybe it's something like, I'd love to garden, but I don't own my own land. That's okay. Maybe you're thinking, I would love to use gardening as self-care, but I live with a toddler. That's all right. Maybe you're thinking, I would love to garden, but I can't physically get up and down from the ground and do that type of physical work. And that's okay too. What I'd like to let you know is, although we won't be talking about all the steps and tips of a successful garden, there are so many resources and examples of people who successfully garden in a lot of different ways that we can draw from that and probably be able to find a way to work with your specific situation. So if our only image of a garden is long, straight rows in the ground that takes a lot of time to tend to, we might not be successful if we have different situations. But if we kind of open up that idea of what a garden could be, and that people use gardens for a lot of different reasons and in different spaces, different ability levels, we really can be using gardening as a self-care process. So with that, I'm going to give a brief introduction to myself, but also let you know we don't want to leave anyone hanging without enough information or ways to follow up when you come across those questions in the middle of the growing season. So by the end, I will give you a link to a website that will have information if you have any questions for me. But also, we'd like you to know how to connect with your local county extension office, whether there's a local horticulture hotline or there is a statewide online Ask a Master Gardener volunteer hotline. And I'm also going to encourage you to think about what are your local resources, whether they're greenhouses or farms, maybe farm markets, that really can help you determine what plants are going to really work best in your area. So we are talking to people all across the state of Ohio, so it's kind of general information, but also want you to utilize that local information. So this slide, I share a picture of a selfie from last year. You see that it's June 2020, and these hashtags kind of explain that it was OSU Faculty and Staff Week. And I have been employed by OSU and worked for Lucas County Extension for over 20 years. And when I first started, I had the opportunity to work with community gardeners. That next hashtag is the Land Grant Fierce, and I feel very honored to work for a land grant university. And not only is it the job of those of us in the extension offices around the state, but everyone who works for Ohio State, that we are here for the people of our state and that we need to extend that research-based knowledge from our campuses into people's homes and backyards and where they'll best use it. That next hashtag, FCS Success, hopefully you recognize FCS as Family and Consumer Sciences. We like to say this is the science you can't live without. So just in case you're not familiar with that, people are more familiar with, may have heard the past term of home economics, but that's been updated to Family Consumer Sciences. And then last but not least, if you're looking at the photo, you can see this is my very small backyard garden last year in June when we realized that we were going to be working out of our home spaces for much longer than a couple weeks. And that's Lucas the gnome. So he's kind of an unofficial mascot for the Lucas County office. But the reason I want to remind you of this is that I am up in Northern Ohio, and I'm here to help and answer questions, but your growing situation might look very different in another part of the state. So that's why connecting with your local county extension office is helpful with some of these topics as well. And we'll make sure you have access to that information. So what we're going to do right now is talk about gardening as a form of self-care. And as we kind of talked about a little bit on a previous slide, gardening can kind of encompass a lot of different things. It can be as small as 5-gallon bucket growing a tomato plant. It could be as large as, 1 acre market garden, which I have a friend that he calls that a garden, whereas to me, an acre of growing plants is maybe much more than a garden. So as far as a definition of gardening, going to Merriam-Webster, to the dictionary, they say that gardening is a plot of ground where herbs, fruits, flowers, or vegetables are cultivated. Doesn't talk about size or anything. They also say that it could be a container. The example might be a window box that's planted usually with a variety of small plants. So just like gardening can be this whole wide array of experiences, self-care can kind of be looked at that as well. It kind of depends which studies and research you come from to have a definition of self-care. But today we'll use this definition from the World Health Organization, that self-care is the ability of individuals, families, and communities to promote health, prevent disease, maintain health, and to cope with illness and disability with or without the support of a healthcare provider. So I hope that kind of looking at those bulleted words on there, we see how that can fit in with gardening and how gardening can be, a hobby or an activity that can be helping promote and maintaining our health, maybe helping prevent disease, especially if we're eating some of that fresh produce from a vegetable or fruit garden. And then the whole idea of coping with illness and disability, that gardening can be used as that self-care practice kind of for some mental health activities as well as the physical benefits. And with that, throughout this series, we've talked about mindfulness, and there are a lot of great programs that we can utilize through your plan for health to learn a lot more about mindfulness. But I'd like to do a very short activity with you today and use this definition from Jon Kabat-Zinn, that mindfulness means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. And what I'd like to do is kind of bring this definition when we think about the garden. It is a beautiful day up here in Northwest Ohio, and it sounds like it is in Central Ohio as well. So it'd be really nice if we could be meeting outside, maybe seeing what's actually going on in the early spring gardens. But one advantage of being online on Zoom together is that more of us could gather. And it really does not matter where you are right here, right now, whether you're standing or sitting, whether you're in the office space, whether you're still working at home, whether you're lounging on the couch or maybe out on the patio outside. I'm going to invite you to do this very short mindfulness practice with me. And this mindfulness practice was written by Chris Bergstrom, and it's about, we're going to use 3 senses. And Chris Bergstrom describes the value of this very short mindfulness practice, that paying attention to our senses is probably the easiest way to practice mindfulness. When we tune into our senses, we're effectively living in the now. Our senses are as now and in the now as it gets. So wherever you're at this moment, I'll just invite you to kind of feel yourself, whether you're standing and your feet rooted on the floor or where you're sitting against a chair or a couch. Kind of feel yourself in that space. And if you'd like to close your eyes, you may. I'll invite you to take a deep breath through your nose and exhale all the way out through your mouth. And go ahead and just take a couple deep breaths, and then just find kind of a regular pace of breathing for yourself. And we are just going to take this moment, no matter where we are in this space. And what I'd like you to do is, if you've closed your eyes, go ahead and open them up and just look right where you are and just look at 3 different things. Just notice what's around you. 3 things. And after you've done that, if it helps to close your eyes, we're going to listen for 3 different sounds. And I'll try not to talk too much through it, although my voice may be one of the sounds you're hearing. There may be something in your space that you've noticed already, or maybe there's sounds that are outside of a window or a wall. And just listen for 3 different sounds. And then the last sense we're going to use right now is the sense of touch. So right where you're at, if you'd like to take your hands and just feel something near you, or if you'd like to kind of focus on maybe the temperature of the room around you and what that feel is like. Or maybe you're just noticing a sense of touch and noticing how maybe your muscles might feel, or if you're leaning against something. So just 3 different sensations of touch in this moment. And then I'll have you go ahead and take a deep breath, inhale in and blow out all the way through your mouth. And just use that very brief mindfulness practice to situate ourselves right here in the moment. We're also going to use that a little bit as a jumping off point to think about using the garden as self-care practice. And so what I'm going to do next is take just a couple minutes to talk through the 5 senses in the garden. And I'm going to use examples from my own garden and from Northwest Ohio, but hopefully as we talk through this, you might be able to picture what's available near you, whether it's public garden space or whether it's possibly in your own yard or a container, and just kind of think about how these 5 senses in the garden can be used to help us as we intentionally make gardening a self-care practice. Because I don't know about you, but I could go through a task list of growing a garden. I could have the seeds and plant them, make sure they're watered, and whether I'm turning on a soaker hose at a certain time or not, I can make sure they're weeded and just go through the motions. But By really making this a self-care practice, we kind of want to make this enjoyable and really use our senses and really be there in the moment of this gardening season. So with that, the first thing we'll talk about is what we might see in the garden. And I don't think it's unusual that maybe the first thing we might think of are a lot of different bright colors. I'm kind of picturing flowers of all different shades and colors. We might see different textures and heights of different plants. If you've ever worked with a landscaper designing a space, we're encouraged to use things of different heights, things that'll bloom at different times of the year. Also, that idea of changes in plant growth. And I'm thinking, you see this picture here that has a plastic zip top bag, and it has the word germinate on it. And there are 3 bean seeds. And you see the date is May 11th, 2020. So this was 1 year ago when I was working at home and my first grader was finishing up the school year at home. So this was one of the science projects. And although I think back and I'm like, well, this is pretty basic. Haven't we all started seeds at some point? But if you haven't started seeds lately, it was pretty amazing to watch these little seeds sprout and germinate. And I wouldn't have normally taken the time to do that. But those are some of the things that if we're using our garden as a place to slow down and notice what's going on, we might notice some of those changes in plant growth, or even if it's the trees and the blossoms, the different colors and times of the year. Another example are the tiny beneficial insects. So by slowing down and noticing the details, we don't have to jump to the first conclusion. There's an insect that's bad, it's going to cause problems. We could actually learn about this and find out that maybe it's a positive. And just some of the little tiny details that kind of bring beauty and help that plant do its job, whether it's the tiny tendrils growing on the vines of a plant to help it climb, just noticing those different things instead of just going through the motions. When we use the sense of hearing, when we're outdoors and in that garden space, there might be those expected sounds. It might be the traffic or neighbor. You might hear birds, but also just kind of taking that time to slow down. And some of those subtle sounds, you might actually hear the leaves blowing, whether there's a slight breeze, the buzzing of the insects like the pollinators. If you've ever grown something like a canna, which is a very tropical looking flower, and it has tubers that you put in the spring, the hummingbirds really like them. And if you're sitting out and that hummingbird flies right by you, it's pretty loud. And thinking about things like the sounds of a drip or a splash, it's not uncommon that water features are used in garden spaces, small ones as well as large ones. Just that sense of sound and how we can slow down and tune into it. And so the question is self-care in the garden as simple as stopping and smelling the roses? So obviously we think about roses and flowers as having strong scents. Some we may really enjoy, prefer over others. Herbs are another good plant that are easy to grow in small spaces or containers that we're going to get that aroma and scent. If you think about, even if you're not growing it in your own garden, but if you're at the store or market and purchasing some strawberries, can you kind of remember what that scent is like of that fresh berry? And we might think more of fruits with those fresh scents, but also the vegetables have their own scents, even the plants. If you think about the tomato leaves on the tomato plant, we're going to have that scent to it. And then all the way to examples like smelling the healthy soil or smelling the rain. And there's actual term for that scientists have been researching. How does this happen? This petrichor. And that's that earthy scent that's produced when that rain falls on dry soil. And then certainly taste, when we're talking about vegetables and herbs and fruits, enjoying that local produce usually is more tasty. And I think back to last week when Jenny was talking about different ways that we can make different vegetables. So if I'm growing a vegetable garden, have a large abundance of something, I might be learning to grill it and roast it and find some recipes to use it raw, but a lot of different ways to enjoy that. There's flowers that are edible. And I like this example of infused water. Infused water does not have a strong flavor like a lot of the bottled flavored drinks, but just kind of that light, refreshing taste that's a little bit more subtle, but by tuning in and enjoying that could be some of those self-care moments. And then kind of that sense of feel, whether it's the weather, whether we're feeling a breeze or the moisture, whether it's literally the plants that we're enjoying the different sensations of the plants, or whether it's those physical movements that we're out there, whether we're doing a large job of hauling mulch and using that as our physical activity, or just kind of the relaxing, enjoying the space and being outdoors. And with this, I wanted to use a quick example. The top picture is a black petunia that we had grown in our front flower bed last year. And this is, to me, kind of the example how kids can be a great example to us as adults to kind of slow down, be in the moment, notice what's going on. So a couple years ago, my preschooler, I'd asked him, well, is there anything you want to grow? And we'd gone to a local greenhouse, and he told me he wanted to grow the soft flowers. And I did not know what he was describing. I would usually use maybe a color or a shape or where they were growing. And he did tell me, well, it was growing in his grandparents' house. So I'm like, well, what are they growing? And they were growing petunias, which petunias are nice, but I'd never touched the petals before and realized how soft they were. But that, as a preschooler, was what he had noticed and tuned into. So he does know the name now, but we call them the soft flowers at our house. And last year we found these black ones that kind of felt like we were growing black velvet in the front of our yard. So sometimes maybe just finding a really typical flower or plant, but finding a new way or kind of slant on it, a different color or something like that might be enjoyable to think about this year. And with that, I do want to go back quickly to the mindfulness, and especially that point of being here on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. A lot of the descriptions I just shared were enjoyable ones or pleasant ones, but when we do anything in life, there may be some little stumbling spots, things that don't go quite the way we expect. And when we're growing a garden, there are certainly things we can plan for and learn, and there is a science to growing plants. But as of right now, we don't know what's going to be happening in the middle of June in the backyard garden or community garden or school garden. So that sense of mindfulness and being present and noticing what's going on, there may be some things that are not as pleasant, and that's okay. Maybe there's scents you don't enjoy in the garden, and it's okay to notice that. Maybe there are some bunnies or slugs or other critters that are taking advantage of the plants you're growing. And although that is not enjoyable, I really invite you to kind of bring that mindful presence and using your senses and just kind of noticing what's going on and kind of following that story that nature's sharing with us at that time. And one last thing, I talked with a group last year and they said, okay, well, this is great, but I don't know if I'm going to get a garden started. Is there anything we can do indoors? And there's certainly a lot of ways. If you're not at the point of starting a large garden, some people have really enjoyed growing houseplants, particularly in this last year that we've lived through this pandemic. I put that idea of daydream, that sometimes just looking through those seed catalogs are enough to kind of have that, for me, help with that pandemic paralysis. There's kind of brighter, newer, fresher things coming along. There is research that shows that just having photos of nature around us can help with some of our stress levels. And I really encourage you, even if it might be considered wildflowers or weeds from the backyard, you can make tiny bouquets. If you grow herbs, you can make bouquets of that, bring that in. And even if you're not growing your own fresh produce, but you visit a farmer's market or farm stand, kind of bringing that sense of gratitude and mindful eating to this produce that some hands have tended, that we've needed that sun, we've needed that rain, that this whole process has this fresh local treat for us to enjoy. So there's ways to enjoy it indoors as well as outdoors. So with that, what I'm going to encourage you is to keep dreaming big, but if you're thinking about using a garden as a self-care process, what's something small that you can feel successful at or really tune into or enjoy in using your senses? I'm also going to remind you to learn more and seek assistance, particularly if you haven't gardened in a while or you're brand new to it. There's a few things to know. Like, one thing I'd like to forewarn today is, even though the weather is beautiful, and it's predicted to be warm and beautiful, we are still at the beginning of April. So there are some plants that are perfectly fine right now, but you need to know what plants they are. There are others, like our tomatoes and peppers, that even though it's warm for us outside, the soil has not warmed up enough. So learn about what you'd like to grow so you can find the best tips that'll be successful. And I encourage you to enjoy yourself and bring that sense of mindfulness to the garden. So with that, how will you use gardening for self-care? And I've added this link at the bottom. It's go.osu.edu/family garden. And with that is a link to a lot of the different things we've talked about today, including a link to find your local extension office. And I'll go ahead, I'll add that in the chat right now. And we'll go over kind of these skill building for week number 4 that, once again, I'm going to encourage you to think about how can gardening complement your other wellness practices? And what are some of your self-care needs, and can plants be part of that? And I'll encourage you to continue dreaming big, but also it's okay to start small, and then seeking out that additional support to learn more about what would grow best for you in your local area. And we thank you for attending today. With that, I'd like to remind you that next week, my colleague, Courtney, will be teaching. She's going to be talking about sustainability at home. She's from Cuyahoga County. And I'll go ahead and wrap up right now. I'll put this slide back on as you think about some of those next steps. Thank you.
All right, we've got a ton of questions, so we will get right into it. The first one is suggestions to keep wild animals like deer, rabbits from using our plants and flowers as food without hurting dogs and cats.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's what I'm working on now. I think it's really going to depend on the wild animals. Bunnies don't need as high of a fencing as the deer. There are some plants I was reading, and this was more about like perennials, like bulbs and flowers that are going to come up every year. Not specifically about vegetables at this moment, but that they don't prefer as much. So depending on where you grow and where you garden, really like looking at what those specific critters are and some ways to deter them. I think with the deer and possibly the rabbits, fencing is probably one of the best solutions, but it's a very permanent solution, which is not the solution for everyone, depending where you're growing.
Okay. I'm thinking of purchasing a raised garden bed. What material, wood or metal, is better?
That's a really good question. So, and there's a lot of advantages to the raised beds. Some of it might be personal preference. Some of it might be what's available, and some of it might be, I might refer you to your local horticulture hotline, that someone who does this kind of more full time, those master gardener volunteers could really look up and talk through the questions with you, what your specific needs are and what you're hoping to accomplish. So that's the advantage of the local hotlines as well as the statewide master gardener volunteer. They will work through a lot of details with you.
I will be starting a container garden. Are there any kinds of flowers that work well when planted together versus the ones that do not work well when planted together?
That's a good. So that too, you're going to really just kind of want to look at the size of the containers and what works well in the different sizes. There's some great fact sheets out there of what plants work well in containers, and that's probably what I would recommend. And I'm trying to think if it's on that link I gave, but if it's not, I'll go ahead and give me till the end of the afternoon. I'll add something up there about container gardens.
Right.
And the tip on container gardens is make sure they're well watered, especially through the summer, but the whole growing season.
Okay. When should we apply pre-emergent to prevent weeds in a flower garden or a mulched bed?
So that's another one. I'm going to refer you to the hotlines because I don't know that off the top of my head. Sorry.
Okay. As someone who is the exact opposite of a green thumb, What types of tips do you have for someone who wants to get into gardening or owning plants but hasn't had any luck with any types or variety?
Well, that's a good question because I do believe gardening can be for everyone. There are certainly some things that are maybe a little more complicated than others. So what I do sometimes, because I work with families and I work with people of all ages, there's a great website that's kidsgardening.com. So sometimes looking back to that example of we sprouted some bean seeds in the window, that seems pretty basic, but it actually was kind of interesting last spring. So don't be afraid to look at ideas of, what we might use to teach young kids about plants. We can take advantage of that as adults as well.
My family had a production greenhouses and gardens, so everything about gardening for me is not calming. It's more stressful. What suggestions do you have to get beyond that so you can get back to enjoying it?
Yeah, and so right, we all come to this point with different histories, and I kind of think about mine. I think I totally took it for granted that there were usually some vegetables growing in the backyard because my mom had grown up on a farm. But your growing space doesn't have to look like that, and that's why sometimes maybe looking for something very different that doesn't look like that commercial. Maybe it's doing a square foot garden. If you look that up, it's in a small space. It's mostly geared towards vegetable gardening. Maybe you want to focus on plants that were not part of that commercial operation, whether it's herbs or vegetables or type of flowers. Just kind of think what works best for you right now in the space you're at.
Next question is, I had to leave a lovely yard and move to a small condo with only a 7x7 deck. The deck gets very hot, full sun in the summer. Any suggestions for small plants that are heat tolerant?
That's a really good question. And I don't have answers right off the top of my head. Although, okay, well, and this just to answer right now immediately, a office I worked out of with OSU Extension at one point had been in an actual house on a main road, and there was a wooden deck behind it. And it was like window boxes on the edges of the deck. And my coworker, who's our horticulturalist, grew succulents in that. And they were beautiful. That was like one of the times I realized, wow, succulents are really pretty. And they've certainly had a comeback, but this was quite a few years ago. So finding some of those that can handle the heat and are maybe a little more drought resistant would be the way you want to go.
Okay, a couple more. Plants or flowers to repel bugs while on my deck?
So there are some that might be recommended. I'm not sure of all the research behind it. Sometimes the stronger smelling herbs, and this too is not something that I would have right off the top of my head, but we could look that up and get that information out. So we want to repel the insects, and I think what I usually read and see often want to repel mosquitoes. And then my other reminder to everyone would be, if there are other insects that are using your plants, they could very much be positive ones or beneficials. So one example I'll give is that in our backyard, where we just grow a little parsley to eat in the herb space, we've watched the full cycle of swallowtail butterflies. And so at the very beginning, you notice these really, really tiny little dark worms. What is that until you learn what it is? So we want to repel the negative ones, but we also want to make sure that we have the positive beneficials around also.
All right. And our final question, in your opinion, is there a preferred way to incorporate the purchased bags of dirt? Lots of bags say are the best for vegetables, but is dirt really dirt?
Okay, so in my opinion, and this goes along with, I have a high schooler who's in ag, and we call dirt's the stuff that gets under your nails or, the corners of the house that needs to be swept out. We really want to have good soil for growing our plants. So whether that's a specific, soil for like a potted container plant or like indoor house plants versus even out, now I'm talking separate, like maybe in the yard or community garden space. We want to have a healthy soil, not just dirt. And with that, particularly growing in the ground, if you're adding things to it, whether it's compost or things like that, it's pretty easy to do a soil test to find out what's going on in your soil and what you might want to focus on adding in those as far as amendments and things like that. Now, at the end of the day, if you've done some gardening projects and you've got some soil left over in a bag, is it going to hurt anything to add it? No, probably not. But if you're specifically growing container gardens or houseplants, you might want to look and read on the packaging that that packaged soil is for those specific circumstances.
Okay, one more question just came in. I have a terrible problem with wasps on a small wooden deck. They are already flying around since the first warm day. Any suggestions to encourage them to go elsewhere?
That's what I'm going to encourage you to use your local horticulture hotline, because they'll give the best updated researched advice. It's not something I've researched lately.
All right. That should wrap up everything for today, everyone. We really just want to say thank you to you, Patrice, for this great session. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we will see you next week.
Thank you.